I still remember the hum of the record player before the needle met the vinyl. That tiny pause right before "I Want to Hold Your Hand" filled the living room. It was a time when the world felt both smaller and limitless. The scent of fresh coffee in chrome diners, the crackle of AM radios on summer mornings, and that unmistakable warmth of a television glow turning from black and white to color for the very first time. The 1960s weren't just a decade. They were a feeling, a mix of innocence, rebellion, and discovery, painted in every shade of possibility. I can still picture those mornings. The sound of the percolator bubbling away on the kitchen counter, that deep, rich aroma of coffee filling every corner of the house before anyone had even spoken a word. The refrigerator would hum softly, a big, rounded GE model with chrome handles and pastel paint that matched the linoleum floor. My mother always moved quietly in those early hours, setting the table for breakfast like she was choreographing something simple but sacred. The clink of ceramic plates, the rustle of the morning newspaper, the hiss of bacon in the skillet. She'd hum a tune from the Supremes while flipping pancakes, her hair perfectly set, even though it was barely 7 in the morning. The world outside felt slower then, calmer somehow. Dad would come down in his white undershirt, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the toaster. There was a rhythm to those mornings, the kind that never felt rushed, even though everyone had somewhere to be. The radio would crackle with the local news, maybe a bit of weather, and then right into a Beatles song or something by the Beach Boys. The DJ's voice always sounded friendly, like someone who actually knew you. And as that music filled the kitchen, the day began, not with screens or notifications, but with sound, smell, and warmth. The living room was where life really happened. Every home had a centerpiece, a television the size of a dresser, framed in polished wood. Ours was a zenith. When the power knob clicked on, the screen came to life slowly, blooming from a tiny dot into a full picture. In the early years, everything was black and white: cowboys, game shows, and the evening news. But when color arrived, it was magic. I remember seeing Bonanza in color for the first time. Those red shirts, the blue skies. It felt like the whole world had changed overnight. We gathered around that set the way people used to gather around campfires. It wasn't just about what we watched. It was the feeling of being together, shoulder to shoulder, in that soft living room glow. Phones were different too. They weren't personal, they were communal. Ours hung on the kitchen wall, a big rotary dial model, avocado green. When it rang, it filled the whole house with sound. You couldn't scroll or text or ignore it. You had to walk over, pick it up, and talk. Sometimes you even shared the line with your neighbors, what they called a party line. You'd lift the receiver and hear someone already talking, and you'd quietly hang up, waiting your turn. And when you finally made your call, you could feel time stretch in those seconds as the dial spun back after each number. There was patience built into every ring. Out front, the cars gleamed like candy. Chevy Impalas, Ford Thunderbirds, pastel station wagons with chrome bumpers that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. On Sundays, you'd see whole families outside washing them, The dads in white t-shirts, the kids with sponges too big for their hands. The radio would play from the open garage, and the smell of soap and wet pavement would mix with the distant sound of lawnmowers. It wasn't about keeping up appearances, it was pride. Your car said something about you, and keeping it spotless was just part of the ritual of American life. Inside, the decor was a story in itself. Walls covered in floral wallpaper, thick shag rugs that seemed to swallow your feet, and couches wrapped in plastic because they were too nice to sit on. Lampshades with tassels, clocks shaped like suns, and a lava lamp bubbling slowly in the corner. A small taste of the futuristic world that was just beginning to appear. Everything in the home had personality, even the appliances. Toasters, radios, blenders, they all had flair, color, and chrome. The future felt close enough to touch, but still wrapped in the comfort of simplicity. Evenings carried their own special rhythm. The sun would set behind the neighborhood rooftops, and you could hear the soft chatter of families through open windows. Dinner was sacred. Everyone at the table, no exceptions. There was no eating in front of the TV, no rushing through it. Just conversation, laughter, and maybe the sound of the evening news playing faintly in another room. When the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, someone would say, "Let's see what's on tonight." And the family would settle back into that familiar glow of the television, wrapped in a sense of peace that only the 1960s seemed to understand. It wasn't perfect, no time ever is, but there was something grounding about those everyday moments. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft static of the TV warming up, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting through an open screen door. It all blended into a quiet kind of happiness that didn't need much explanation. Back then, life didn't ask for more. It was enough just to be there, together, living one ordinary, beautiful day at a time. Saturdays had their own feeling back then, a little lighter, a little freer. You'd wake up to the sound of the lawnmower outside, maybe the neighbor's sprinklers ticking rhythmically back and forth. The sunlight always seemed warmer on weekends, streaming through thin curtains that smelled faintly of detergent and summer air. There was no rush, no alarms, just the smell of pancakes, bacon, and the faint static hum of cartoons coming from the living room. Every kid had a ritual. Mine started with cereal, always poured too high, always leaving those sugary loops floating on top of the milk. We'd sit cross-legged on the floor in front of the TV, faces inches away from the screen, watching the Jetsons, the Flintstones, Yogi Bear. The commercials were half the fun. Toys spinning on strings, Hot Wheels racing around orange tracks, and the jingle of a new breakfast cereal you suddenly couldn't live without. Parents didn't worry about screen time back then. The cartoons ended by noon, and by then, you were already halfway out the door. Outside, the street was alive. Bikes leaned against every fence, baseball gloves left on lawns, jump ropes tied to mailboxes. The world was our playground, and nobody needed supervision. We'd play until our legs burned, riding until the light faded orange and the streetlights began to hum. Be home before dark, that was the only rule. And somehow, everyone always made it. You could feel the neighborhood breathe together. Every porch radio tuned to the same station. Every backyard grill starting up as the sun dipped low. And there was always music. Always. Even in the quiet moments, someone, somewhere was playing something. Maybe a transistor radio tucked into a shirt pocket or a record player spinning in a living room down the street. Music drifted through the air like the scent of summer, soft, steady, everywhere. You'd hear the Supremes from one house, the Rolling Stones from another, and maybe Elvis from the car that passed by. Every melody seemed to mark time, a rhythm for growing up. Even errands felt different then. Families piled into station wagons for grocery runs or trips to Sears. Kids fighting for the window seats while Dad fiddled with the car radio, trying to catch the baseball game. The parking lots always seemed endless, filled with tail fins and chrome, sunlight flashing across polished paint. Inside, the stores were full of wonder. New TVs with shiny knobs, washing machines with proud labels that read, "Made in America," and aisles of toys that smelled faintly of plastic and cardboard dreams. There was something deeply comforting about it, a sense of progress that everyone shared, even in small ways. Dinner time carried a quiet rhythm too. The sound of silverware drawers, plates clinking on the counter, the hum of a small fan trying to fight the summer heat. Moms called from the kitchen window for the kids to come in, voices carried by the soft wind. The smell of roast chicken or meatloaf filled the house, and by the time everyone sat down, the day's noise melted into gentle conversation. Someone might mention a neighbor who bought a color TV or a cousin who was drafted, but mostly it was laughter and stories that didn't go anywhere, the kind that still stay with you somehow. After dinner, the world slowed again. The porch light flicked on, and crickets began their evening chorus. You could hear a radio softly playing Moon River or Stand By Me through someone's open window. Sometimes we'd pile into the car for ice cream, the kind served from small stands with flickering neon signs. Chocolate-dipped cones, cherry sodas, and melted smiles in the rearview mirror. The air smelled like freedom and gasoline. Nights in the 1960s had their own kind of magic. No bright screens, no endless scrolls, just the slow rhythm of the world winding down. Maybe Dad would turn on the hi-fi, that rich warm sound filling the room as the needle found its groove. Mom might hum along while folding laundry, the living room dim except for the amber glow of a table lamp. You could almost hear the house breathe, wood creaking, pipes humming, the quiet heartbeat of family life. It's funny how ordinary it all was, and how extraordinary it feels looking back. Every routine, every small sound, every smell stitched together to make something whole. Life wasn't about chasing moments then, it was about living inside them. We didn't record it or post it or measure it against anyone else's, we just were. And maybe that's why it lingers, because in the rhythm of those simple days, in the warmth of those familiar sounds, we learned what it meant to really feel at home in the world. Sunday mornings had their own rhythm, slow, deliberate, almost sacred in their simplicity. The house felt quieter, softer somehow. The sunlight came through in long golden streaks, catching dust motes that floated lazily in the still air. The smell of breakfast was different too, richer, slower. No quick cereal or toast today. It was biscuits, bacon, and eggs cooked in cast iron. You could hear the faint hiss of the skillet, the crackle of a radio preacher's voice somewhere in the distance, and the steady flipping of a newspaper page. There was peace in the air, the kind that didn't need to be explained. Families took their time. Dad in a pressed shirt, Mom in a dress she'd ironed the night before, kids in small polished shoes that always pinched a little. Sunday school books stacked by the door, the family car freshly washed in the driveway. The church bells would start just before 10, echoing softly through the neighborhood, that gentle, faraway chime that seemed to make everyone pause, even those who didn't go. There was a sense of community, an unspoken understanding that the world slowed down together for just one morning each week. After church came the real heart of the day, Sunday dinner. The kitchen would come alive again, filled with the sound of clattering dishes, oven doors, and laughter. Roasts, mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, green beans with bacon, and a pie cooling on the counter. Everything smelled like home. Relatives would drop by unannounced, bringing pies or just good stories. Someone always told the same joke they'd told the week before, and everyone laughed like it was new. The kids would sneak outside again, chasing each other across the lawn in their dress clothes, grass stains already spreading on clean knees. Afternoons stretched long and unhurried. The adults would move to the porch or the den, talking about the news or the weather or who just bought a new car. There was always a baseball game playing faintly on someone's transistor radio, that steady murmur of the announcer calling every pitch. The sound mixed with the breeze, the hum of insects, and the distant buzz of a neighbor mowing their lawn. It was the soundtrack of summer, of normal life, of everything steady and good. Sometimes we'd pile into the car for a Sunday drive. No destination, no hurry. Just rolling through town with the windows down, the warm wind filling the car, and the radio playing songs that now feel timeless. My Girl, Runaway, Can't Help Falling in Love. The road stretched endlessly, lined with diners, gas stations, and billboards advertising Coca-Cola or Ford's newest model. Gas was cheap, and time was cheaper. We didn't realize it then, but those drives were a kind of therapy, a quiet escape where no one said much, but everyone felt content. Evenings carried that perfect kind of stillness. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. Porch lights began to blink on one by one, and the air smelled faintly of charcoal and cut grass. You could hear the soft pop of screen doors, the murmur of televisions through open windows, and the click of someone's typewriter in the next house. Inside, we'd settle into our familiar spots. Dad in his chair, Mom with her sewing, kids sprawled on the rug in front of the TV. The Ed Sullivan Show, the Andy Griffith Show, Gunsmoke, whatever was on, everyone watched together. The living room became the evening's heartbeat. Sometimes there were small rituals that meant more than they looked. Folding laundry while watching the news. Licking the spoon after making a cake. Turning off the lights in the kitchen and leaving only the stove lamp glowing. a soft, steady reminder that another day was done. Those little moments stitched the week together. They gave life a rhythm, something predictable, something real. And when bedtime came, the world outside felt utterly still. The only sounds were the crickets and the occasional distant car. You'd hear the soft click of the light switch, the rustle of sheets, the low hum of the refrigerator in the dark. The house settled, and so did everyone in it. Looking back, it wasn't the big moments that defined the 1960s. It was this: the slow Sundays, the simple routines, the shared silences that said more than words ever could. Life had edges then, real beginnings and endings to each day. The week unfolded like a familiar song, and somehow, that predictability felt comforting. You knew what tomorrow would bring, and there was peace in that. Today, those memories feel almost like dreams, too warm, too perfect to belong to anything real. But they were real. They were ordinary and human and full of meaning. That's what made life in the 1960s so unforgettable. Not the inventions or the headlines, but the way the light fell across the breakfast table, the way music drifted through an open window, and the way time seemed to move just slow enough for everyone to feel it. There was something about evenings in the 1960s that felt almost cinematic, even if nothing was happening. The air would cool, the sky would fade into soft pinks and deep purples, and you could hear the hum of televisions drifting from house to house like an invisible connection tying the neighborhood together. Every home seemed to have its own glow, not from LED screens or phones, but from those warm, flickering tubes inside the TV sets. You'd walk down the street and see them through the curtains. Flashes of color, silhouettes of families leaning close, laughter carrying out through half-open windows. It was the sound of togetherness. When our living room lights dimmed and that big wooden zenith came to life, everything else stopped. The faint click of the power knob, the static buzz, the screen blooming into brightness. It was hypnotic. There were only a few channels to choose from, but it didn't matter. The choices we had felt like plenty. Bonanza, I Dream of Jeannie, The Twilight Zone, Bewitched, The Andy Griffith Show. Each one had its own kind of comfort, its own world that seemed both distant and familiar. You didn't just watch, you settled into it. And every commercial, for Coca-Cola, for Ford, for Winston cigarettes, came with its own jingle that stuck in your head for days. It wasn't just the shows, it was the ritual. Someone always adjusted the antenna. Someone else argued about volume. Someone had to sit cross-legged on the rug because the good seats were already taken. The smell of popcorn or TV dinners sometimes lingered in the air. Those shiny aluminum trays with neat little sections. Mashed potatoes, meatloaf, peas. Eating while watching felt like a small rebellion, even though everyone did it. The fork would scrape the tray, the laughter track would play, and for 30 minutes, life felt simple. Weeknights had their rhythm too. Mondays might be for Gunsmoke, Wednesdays for the Beverly Hillbillies, and Fridays. Well, Fridays were special. That was when the week finally let go of your shoulders. Dad would come home with a loosened tie, Mom with a look that said, "We made it through." Sometimes there'd be takeout, burgers and fries in wax paper bags that left little grease stains on the kitchen counter. The kids would stay up a bit later, pretending to read comic books, but really waiting for that last show before bedtime. Music drifted everywhere, even inside. Radios were always on, perched on countertops, tucked in garages, or playing softly in bedrooms. The songs were like time markers, the Beatles singing All My Loving, the Beach Boys dreaming of California, Sam Cooke promising a change to come. The melodies carried through every part of life, from breakfast to bedtime. Sometimes, on quiet nights, you'd lie in bed with the transistor radio under your pillow, volume turned low, the glow of its tiny dial illuminating your hands. It was private, personal, your own little world of sound. And there were evenings when families didn't watch or listen, they just were. Maybe a board game spread out on the dining table, Monopoly pieces scattered across the board, someone pretending to be the banker and always taking it too seriously. Maybe a deck of cards, maybe nothing at all but conversation. The house would fill with the small sounds of living. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the soft tick of a wall clock. It wasn't entertainment, it was peace. The decor around us always seemed to reflect the times. Lamps with fringed shades, patterned curtains, ashtrays on every table even if no one smoked. Lava lamps that moved like slow-motion dreams. It was a mix of old and new, tradition and modernity, the world caught in transition, right there in the living room. The future was promised in the glossy pages of Life magazine and hinted at in every appliance ad that promised to make tomorrow easier. And yet, even with all that change, life still felt grounded. People talked to each other. They wrote letters. They borrowed sugar from neighbors and actually returned the cup. There were unspoken rules of community, the kind built not from laws but from kindness. If someone's car wouldn't start, two men from across the street would be under the hood before the coffee had cooled. If someone was sick, casseroles appeared like clockwork. There was a softness to the way people lived, a trust that the world was still small enough to care. By the time the evening news came on, the house would quiet down. Walter Cronkite's voice filled the room, steady and calm, like an anchor in an uncertain sea. The black and white images on the screen felt larger than life. Men in suits shaking hands, rockets lifting toward the sky, headlines that would one day become history. But to us, it was all just another night. The TV would fade to static, the lights would go off one by one, and the house would slip into silence again. Looking back, I realized that those evenings weren't about entertainment or information. They were about connection, about sharing space and time, about watching the same thing and reacting together. There was something profoundly human in that, a kind of closeness that doesn't need words. It was the rhythm of the 1960s, soft light, steady voices, and the unspoken comfort of knowing that for one more night, the world outside could wait. There was a magic to the way the 1960s smelled, sounded, and felt once you stepped outside your front door. The world seemed brighter, not because of screens or neon lights, but because everything had a kind of tangible life to it. The streets were lined with tidy lawns, each one carefully trimmed and edged, every mailbox polished and upright. Kids would ride their bikes in small groups, baseball gloves hanging from the handlebars, their laughter echoing between the houses. The sound of a screen door slamming was part of the soundtrack of every summer afternoon. You could always tell what time of day it was just by listening. The buzz of lawnmowers meant late morning. The jingle of the ice cream truck told you the afternoon was in full swing. And the distant bark of a dog or the low hum of passing cars meant the evening was on its way. Everything ran on an unwritten schedule, and nobody needed a phone to keep time. The world's rhythm was steady, and you moved with it naturally. The neighborhood itself felt alive. You knew everyone's name, and everyone knew yours. Mr. Peterson next door always seemed to be fixing his car, a powder blue Chevy with the hood propped open and the smell of gasoline in the air. Across the street, Mrs. Reynolds watered her roses every day at the same hour, wearing her gardening gloves and a wide straw hat. There was a sense of routine, but it never felt boring. It felt dependable. You could count on people, on their habits, their kindness, their presence. Even errands felt like small adventures. The grocery store wasn't a massive warehouse. It was a place where the butcher knew your order by heart and the clerk asked about your kids. The air was cool and faintly metallic from the freezers. Rows of Campbell's soup cans gleamed like a painted mural of red and white. Boxes of Jell-O, cans of Spam, and cereal mascots with wide smiles filled the shelves. You'd hear the soft squeak of shopping cart wheels and the dull thud of items landing in brown paper bags. It wasn't shopping, it was part of the rhythm of life, a social act as much as a necessity. And when you stopped by the diner afterward, it felt like stepping into the heart of America. Chrome stools lined the counter, vinyl booths hugged the corners, and the smell of coffee, burgers, and vanilla milkshakes filled the air. The jukebox glowed in the corner, playing songs for a nickel. Maybe the Ronettes, maybe the Beach Boys. The sound of laughter, silverware, and spinning records blended into something warm, something safe. There was always a waitress who called you Han, always a couple on their first date splitting fries, always a man at the end of the counter reading the newspaper with a cigarette balanced between his fingers. Downtown had its own energy. Department stores with glass windows displaying mannequins in new spring dresses. Toy aisles filled with slinkies, model cars, and shiny red wagons. The smell of perfume near the cosmetics counter mixed with the waxy scent of polished floors. You could still hear the clicking of typewriters from nearby offices, and outside, newsboys shouted headlines that mattered more when you could hold them in your hands. It wasn't fast, but it was alive. Every face you passed felt like part of a bigger story. Evenings in town felt cinematic. Movie theaters with big, glowing marquees and ticket prices that didn't break the bank. Walking up to the counter and hearing the projector were before the lights dimmed, that was magic. The smell of buttered popcorn, the crackling film reel, and that moment when the screen lit up with faces larger than life. Maybe you were watching Psycho, maybe Mary Poppins, it didn't matter. For a few hours, everyone in the room felt the same emotions together. And then there were the drives home afterward, quiet, slow, with the car windows rolled down. The night air was cool, filled with the faint scent of gasoline and freshly cut grass. The radio played softly, and the roads were empty except for the steady rhythm of the streetlights passing overhead. It was peaceful in a way that's hard to describe now. You didn't have to talk. You didn't have to fill the silence. The sound of the tires on the asphalt was enough. Back in the neighborhood, the houses glowed with soft lamplight. Curtains drawn, TVs flickering, the world winding down again. You could hear a dog bark, a baby cry somewhere in the distance, the faint clink of dishes being washed. Everything felt close, not just physically, but emotionally. You belonged to something, a place, a time, a heartbeat that pulsed through every street and every home. Looking back, that's what stands out most, the sense of belonging. The way life in the 1960s wrapped around you like a familiar blanket. The small routines that built a world you could trust. The sounds, the smells, the people, all stitched together into something that wasn't perfect, but felt whole. The world was changing fast, yet somehow, it always found time to slow down long enough for everyone to catch their breath. And in that pause, in that ordinary, golden stillness, life felt exactly right. It's strange how memory works, how the smallest details of a decade can stay etched in your mind more vividly than the big events. I remember the feeling of walking into the living room just after dinner, the lights dimmed, the faint smell of pot roast still lingering in the air. Someone would adjust the antenna, someone else would kick off their shoes, and the TV would hum to life with that soft static buzz. The picture would flicker, and suddenly the world outside didn't matter anymore. For half an hour, maybe an hour, the world shrank down to a single screen glowing in the dark. The first time I saw color television, it felt like seeing magic for real. We'd all gathered around to watch Bonanza, and when those bright red shirts and blue skies filled the screen, you could hear a gasp from everyone in the room. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a glimpse of the future. Every family in the neighborhood talked about it for weeks. People invited friends over just to see the colors for themselves. Some would stand too close to the screen, squinting, trying to figure out how it worked. You could feel the pride in owning something that new, that advanced. The TV wasn't just a machine, it was a window to a bigger world, even if the stories it showed were simple. And yet, despite the newness of it all, life never lost its warmth. After the shows ended, we'd turn off the TV and sit in the quiet glow of the lamps. Someone might start humming a tune or tell a story that had been told 100 times before. The house would creak softly as if it were listening. Evenings ended with the same gentle rhythm, lights going out one by one, the faint buzz of the radio fading into silence, and that comforting moment when the whole house seemed to exhale. There were moments when time itself felt slower. I remember sitting by the window during rainstorms, watching the drops race down the glass while the Beatles played on the turntable. The crackle of vinyl mixed with the sound of thunder in the distance. You didn't skip songs or shuffle playlists. You listened, start to finish. The pops and hisses on the record were part of the experience. Sometimes I'd stare at the spinning label in the center of the vinyl, memorizing its colors, like each rotation was another turn deeper into the music. Music was everywhere, at home, in cars, at dances, even in grocery stores. The melodies carried emotions that everyone seemed to understand, no matter where they came from. A song could make you fall in love, make you cry, make you believe that the world was about to change for the better. You didn't need to know the artist personally. You just needed to feel the song. The radio announcers always spoke like they were part of your family, their voices familiar, their laughter warm. Late night stations would play love songs, and sometimes you'd fall asleep before the end, the radio still glowing softly in the dark. Sundays often ended with reflection. Families would gather for one last meal before the week began again. Leftovers from lunch, maybe a pie that hadn't been touched earlier. The conversation would drift between real plans and gentle daydreams. Maybe we'll go to the beach next weekend. Maybe I'll repaint the porch. There was something hopeful about the way people spoke back then, like the future was something you could shape with your own two hands. And then there were those quiet moments before bed, the ones that still linger all these years later. The sound of running water as someone brushed their teeth, the creak of the hallway floorboards, the faint smell of soap and laundry. You'd pull up the covers and stare at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the steady rhythm of the clock ticking on the dresser. Somewhere in the distance, maybe a car passed by, its headlights flashing through the window like ghosts of motion. And then silence. Not the kind of silence we have now, filled with faint electronic noise, but a true stillness. A silence that wrapped around you like safety. Lying there, you could feel life breathing all around you. The warmth of family nearby. The comfort of a world that felt smaller, slower, and kinder. There were no late-night screens or glowing phones. No distractions waiting just beyond the door. Only the steady heartbeat of the house, the world outside resting, and a feeling, hard to describe but impossible to forget, that tomorrow would arrive quietly, like the morning light through those thin white curtains. When I think back on those nights, I don't just remember them, I feel them. The softness of the pillow, the smell of clean sheets, the way the world seemed to hum in perfect rhythm. It wasn't about what we had. It was about how deeply we noticed it. The clatter of the dinner plates, the laughter from the living room, the hush that followed after the TV turned off. Those were the sounds of the 1960s. Ordinary moments that somehow became timeless, glowing brighter in memory with every passing year. There was a kind of honesty to the days back then, a grounded rhythm that carried you from morning to night without ever asking for more than your presence. The 1960s had a texture, a pulse. You could feel it in the clothes you wore, in the way the sunlight hit the sidewalk, even in the weight of the coins in your pocket. Everything felt tangible, real in a way that's hard to explain now. I remember walking down Main Street on summer afternoons when the heat shimmered on the asphalt and the air smelled faintly of gasoline and freshly baked bread from the corner bakery. Shop windows were dressed with mannequins wearing bright dresses and suits that looked like something from the future. Record stores sat between barber shops and diners, their doors propped open, letting the sound of the Beatles or the Temptations spill onto the street. The music became part of the atmosphere, weaving through the chatter of people, the clang of cash registers, and the ring of the bicycle bell from the kid delivering newspapers. You could buy almost everything you needed within a few blocks. A hardware store that sold everything from nails to fishing poles. A five and dime that smelled of paper, perfume, and penny candy. Those stores had a heartbeat of their own. Wooden floors that creaked under every step, ceiling fans that turned lazily overhead, and clerks who greeted you by name. It wasn't shopping. It was visiting a familiar part of your life. There was comfort in routine, in the faces that never changed, in the knowing that some things stayed the same even as the world outside began to move faster. At the gas station, the attendants still wore uniforms with their names stitched on the pocket. They'd wash your windshield, check your oil, and hand you a receipt with a smile. You didn't even have to get out of the car. The sound of the pump clicking off, the faint smell of motor oil, and the soft hum of the engine idling, all of it was part of the soundtrack of the 60s. The cars themselves were works of art, sleek, bold, full of chrome and personality. They didn't just take you places, they made you feel like you were going somewhere important, even if it was just across town. On the weekends, families would pile into those cars and head to drive-in theaters or out-of-town diners. The kids in the back seat would fight for the window view, while the parents sang along softly to whatever was on the radio. Sometimes it was Sinatra, sometimes the Supremes. You'd roll down the windows and let the air rush in, warm and alive, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant barbecues. There was something peaceful about the motion, the blur of telephone poles, the steady hum of tires against the road. No one needed to say much. The ride itself was the moment. Summer nights had a pulse all their own. The sound of sprinklers clicking in perfect rhythm, the soft buzz of streetlights, the echo of laughter from kids playing one last game before curfew. Screen doors opened and closed as parents called out names into the darkening air. Sometimes you'd see couples sitting on porches, rocking slowly, sharing a cigarette or just silence. Fireflies blinked across the lawns, and for a few precious moments, the whole world seemed suspended, simple, unhurried, content. Even boredom back then felt meaningful. Sitting on a curb, tossing pebbles, talking about nothing, waiting for a song to come on the radio instead of skipping through thousands. That waiting, that stillness, gave things value. You learned patience without even realizing it. You learned to notice the sound of wind through trees, the texture of the sidewalk under your palms, the faint hum of electricity in the telephone wires. When night finally settled, the town would fall quiet, one light at a time. You could hear the faint, distant whistle of a train, the low rumble as it passed, and then the deep, steady silence that followed. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a record spun its final note before the needle reached the center and clicked endlessly in the dark. Those were the moments that defined life in the 1960s, not the headlines or inventions, but the pauses in between. the spaces where time seemed to hold its breath. Everything had weight and presence. The smell of old books, the smooth surface of a vinyl record, the metallic clink of spare change, the soft flicker of a street light against a parked car. It was a world made of textures, sounds, and slow moments that somehow added up to something bigger, a quiet kind of happiness that didn't need to announce itself. Looking back, I think what made it so special was how real it all felt. You didn't chase moments, you lived inside them. Every second had its own warmth, its own hum. And even now, when I hear the faint crackle of an old record or catch a whiff of gasoline in the summer air, it all comes rushing back. The stillness, the laughter, the unspoken promise that life was good and would keep being good, if only you slowed down long enough to feel it. Sundown in the 60s carried a kind of hush that's hard to describe. The lights softened into a pale gold, stretching across the lawns and rooftops, turning everything into slow motion. You could hear screen doors shutting, one after another, like a quiet signal that the day was winding down. The smell of dinner carried through the air, roast chicken, baked potatoes, something sweet cooling on the windowsill. Radios murmured through open windows. Dogs barked in the distance. There was a steadiness to those hours, a sense that the whole world was catching its breath at the same time. Even the sky seemed to linger a little longer before giving way to night. Kids dragged their feet coming home, baseball gloves slung over their shoulders, hair messy and knees scraped. The sidewalks still warm under bare feet. Porch lights flicked on one by one, small beacons marking the end of playtime. You could hear mothers calling from doorways, the same soft tone, repeated in a dozen houses up and down the street. And every kid knew when their name was called, the day was officially over. Inside, the house glowed with that familiar amber light, warm, comforting, filled with the faint hum of the evening news. Someone would be setting the table, someone else changing into pajamas. The air always carried a mix of food, detergent, and the faint mustiness of old furniture that had absorbed years of living. The radio might still be playing softly from the kitchen, a Sinatra ballad, or maybe a tune by Patsy Cline, something gentle enough to let you drift. Dinner wasn't rushed. Families sat together, not because they had to, but because that's just what people did. There was no background noise, no phones, no interruptions, only conversation. The clink of silverware, the scrape of chairs, the occasional burst of laughter. Sometimes the topics were trivial, school grades, a neighbor's new car, the weather. Other times, they brushed against the world beyond the walls. Talk of astronauts, of faraway wars, of things changing faster than anyone could quite understand. But no matter what, dinner always ended the same way, with someone saying, "Save room for dessert." And somehow, there always was. Afterward, the night found its rhythm again. The dishes were washed by hand, steam fogging the kitchen window. The sound of plates stacking, water running, and radios humming blended together into a kind of domestic symphony. Out on the street, headlights glided past, their beams cutting across living room curtains. Somewhere, The low rumble of a passing train faded into the dark. Life had a pulse you could feel, steady, grounded, endlessly reassuring. Sometimes, after the dishes were done, families would take a walk around the block. The air was cooler then, touched with the faint sweetness of cut grass and blooming flowers. Porch conversations floated from every direction, neighbors chatting, laughing, trading small bits of news. You could hear the faint crackle of a transistor radio tuned to a baseball game, the crowd roaring softly in the distance like waves. Streetlights buzzed overhead, drawing circles of light on the pavement where moths danced. It was ordinary and beautiful all at once. When the walk ended and the night deepened, everyone retreated inside. Kids brushed their teeth, complained about bedtime, and crawled under sheets that smelled like sun and laundry soap. Parents turned down the lights, checked the locks, and sometimes sat a few quiet minutes longer by the window, maybe with a cigarette, maybe with a cup of tea, just watching, listening, thinking. There was something safe about those nights. The way the dark didn't feel threatening, just vast and familiar. The world outside might have been changing, but inside those walls, things stayed constant. You could count on the same soft creaks from the floorboards, the steady tick of the wall clock, the sigh of the house settling as the temperature dropped. That constancy was its own kind of comfort, a quiet promise that tomorrow would come, just like today had, filled with the same simple rituals that made life whole. Even now, decades later, when I close my eyes, I can still feel it, the cool cotton of the bed sheets, the faint flicker of light through the curtains, the hum of the refrigerator in the dark. I can hear the last strains of a song fading out on the radio, replaced by the calm voice of an announcer wishing everyone a good night. And then, that perfect silence, the kind that only existed when the world finally stopped moving. That's what the 60s really were. Not just a decade of invention and revolution, but of rhythm. The rhythm of quiet streets, clinking dishes, murmured voices, and slow, honest evenings. It was a world where people still paused, still listened, still believed that ordinary life was something to be cherished. And maybe that's why those nights stay with me. Because in their stillness, in their simplicity, they remind me of a time when peace wasn't something we searched for. It was just there, waiting at the end of every day. Mornings in the 1960s had their own kind of optimism. Soft, steady, almost musical. The world woke up slowly then. The sun came in through thin curtains, cutting across wooden floors and dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The first sounds were always the same. The click of the toaster, the soft whistle of a kettle, the thud of a newspaper landing on the front step. You could smell coffee before you even opened your eyes. It wasn't rushed coffee, not grabbed on the way out, but brewed patiently, one careful cup at a time. There was a kind of choreography to breakfast. Plates set out, butter knives clinking, cereal boxes standing like small billboards on the table. Cornflakes, Cheerios, maybe Frosted Flakes if it was a special week. Someone was always humming. Maybe mom, maybe dad. The radio in the kitchen played softly, local news, a weather update, and then a burst of something cheerful, Maybe She Loves You by the Beatles or My Guy by Mary Wells. It was the sound of an entire generation moving in rhythm, unhurried, grounded, together. The world outside felt alive, but never overwhelming. The morning air carried a hint of gasoline from cars warming up in driveways, mixed with the smell of freshly cut grass and something faintly metallic from the dew. You'd hear screen doors slam as fathers headed off to work, briefcases in hand, ties neatly tucked, giving a quick wave to the neighbors before stepping into shiny Chevrolets or Fords. Mothers stood at the doorways in slippers, waving back, sometimes holding a cup of coffee that was already going cold. Children walked to school in small clusters. Backpacks weren't a thing yet, just books tied together with belts or carried under arms. The girls wore dresses with ribbons in their hair. The boys had their shirts tucked in and hair slicked to one side. The walk itself was part of the day. The sound of footsteps on sidewalks, the occasional bark from a dog behind a fence, the smell of chalk dust that seemed to follow from one classroom to the next. You didn't text a friend to say you were coming. You just showed up. The world worked that way, by trust, by habit, by knowing people would be where they said they'd be. Inside the schools, everything felt orderly. Wooden desks with metal legs, chalkboards that squeaked under a teacher's steady hand, the faint scent of pencil shavings and paper. Teachers were strict but steady. They commanded respect without ever having to demand it. There were no tablets or screens, just books, rulers, and imagination. The click of a film projector was an event, the lights dimming, the room falling silent as the reels spun, the faint hum of machinery filling the space. And when recess came, it was freedom. The sound of jump ropes hitting pavement, baseballs cracking off bats, laughter echoing off brick walls. Time slowed down again. After school, the rhythm shifted back to something familiar. Kids dropped their books on the kitchen table, grabbed a glass of milk, and headed outside again. The neighborhood was their universe. Bikes leaning on mailboxes, basketball hoops nailed above garages, friends calling each other by nickname. There were no arranged playdates, no schedules. You just knocked on a door and asked, "Can you come out?" And more often than not, the answer was yes. By late afternoon, the streets shimmered with sunlight and the smell of dinner starting to cook. You'd hear the sizzle of onions through open windows, the rattle of pots and pans, the faint sound of a record spinning in another house. Radios kept everyone company. The voices of DJs were familiar friends, smooth, confident, always smiling through the speakers. They announced the latest hits, gave the weather, told you what was happening in the world. But even when the news was heavy, their tone stayed gentle, reassuring. It was the sound of a time when words carried calm instead of noise. The mail would arrive with a soft clang of the box, letters with real handwriting, postcards from relatives, catalogs full of color and promise. You'd thumb through the Sears catalog and dream. A new bike, a record player, maybe a lava lamp. The future looked exciting, but never out of reach. It was coming piece by piece, just like everything else. And as the day began to fade, the world seemed to glow in a way that was purely its own. The lawns were neat. The sky was painted in orange and pink, and somewhere down the street, the faint sound of someone practicing the guitar drifted through the air. The 1960s weren't about perfection, they were about presence, about being there in each small, fleeting moment, without needing to capture it or compare it. You didn't think about nostalgia then, you were too busy living it. And maybe that's the real beauty of it all. No one realized how special it was until it was gone, until the noise of later decades replaced the quiet hum of a world that once knew how to simply be. The world of the 1960s moved at a human pace. You could feel time stretch and breathe, giving space for everything, for thought, for silence, for simple joy. The mornings belonged to work and school, but the afternoons, those belonged to living. When the final school bell rang, kids didn't scatter into cars or rush to schedules. They poured out into the sunshine, carrying laughter and energy that could fill an entire street. Bicycles were everywhere. Schwinns with chrome fenders that caught the light, banana seats that creaked a little when you leaned into a turn, and streamers fluttering from the handlebars like streaks of color in motion. The air was thick with the smell of tar and grass, with the sound of card spokes clicking as the bikes raced downhill. Every block had its own landmarks. The cracked sidewalk where someone fell last summer, the tree whose roots had lifted the pavement, the corner store that always smelled like gum and newspapers. A quarter felt like power in your pocket. With it, you could buy a cold bottle of Coca-Cola, a pack of baseball cards, or a candy bar wrapped in shiny foil that seemed too perfect to tear open. Parents didn't worry the way they do now. They trusted the world to watch over their kids, and somehow, it did. You could disappear for hours, exploring empty lots, climbing fences, skipping stones across puddles after the rain. When someone's mom called out from a porch, it was like a bell that rang for the whole neighborhood. Everyone knew it was time to start heading home. The sky turned amber, the streetlights blinked awake, and the shadows stretched long across the pavement. Saturdays were special, not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't have to do. No school, no rush, no plans that couldn't be broken. The morning began with cartoons, of course, then spilled into a day that felt endless. You might wash the car with your dad, the garden hose spraying arcs of sunlight, the scent of wet concrete filling the air. You might help hang laundry outside, clothespins snapping in rhythm, sheets billowing like sails in the breeze. Or maybe you'd just lie on the freshly cut grass, looking up at clouds that seemed close enough to touch, trying to spot shapes and stories in their slow drift. Weekends had their own soundtrack, a radio humming in the background, maybe the Four Seasons or Roy Orbison playing through static. Radios weren't just devices, they were companions. Portable ones went everywhere, to the park, the beach, the porch swing. People shared music the way they shared stories, out loud, together. When a favorite song came on, you didn't skip it or save it. You just listened completely. Even errands carried a kind of charm. Riding in the car to the supermarket or the hardware store felt like a small adventure. The windows were rolled down, the air rushing in, The smell of leather seats and gasoline mixing with whatever perfume Mom wore that day. At red lights, you'd glance into other cars and see people smiling, waving. Everyone looked connected somehow, part of a shared rhythm that stretched across towns, across families, across a country still learning how to dream. Sunday afternoons often felt like the pause button on life. Church in the morning, a family lunch afterward, the kind that filled every corner of the table. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and rolls so soft they almost melted in your hands. Dessert wasn't fancy. Maybe jello, maybe a pie, maybe cookies still warm from the oven. Afterward, people rested, not out of laziness, but because it was part of the rhythm. You earned your rest back then. You slowed down to catch your breath and to notice the things that really mattered. The quiet ticking of the clock, the sound of wind through the curtains, the sight of sunlight creeping slowly across the floorboards. Evenings often ended outside again. A baseball game in the street, someone's dad tossing a ball underhand to a circle of kids. The crack of the bat, the cheer that followed, the ball rolling just out of reach into a patch of tall grass. Porch lights flickered on as the sky deepened, one by one, like stars rising from the ground. You could hear record players spinning through open windows, music mixing and overlapping, soft voices floating into the warm air. Looking back, what stands out isn't the grandness of it all, but the texture, the way every sound, every smell, every routine felt real. The warmth of a hand-cranked ice cream maker, the scrape of chalk on the driveway, the hum of cicadas rising from the trees as the night settled in. Life had edges, weight, patience. It asked you to participate, to show up, to notice, to care. And maybe that's why it lingers so vividly. Because the 1960s weren't just a collection of moments. They were an atmosphere, a living heartbeat. They taught you how to find meaning in stillness, how to feel time instead of racing through it. And in those long, golden afternoons, when the air was thick with sun and the laughter of friends echoed across the street, it felt like the world would stay that way forever. Summer in the 1960s had its own scent, a mix of cut grass, hot pavement, and chlorine from the community pool that clung to your skin long after you got home. The days stretched endlessly then, like time itself slowed down to let you savor every minute. School was out, shoes were optional, and the world felt wide open. The morning started early, but not because anyone made you get up. It was the sunlight. It would pour in through thin curtains, washing everything in gold. You'd lie there listening to the world wake up, the faint rumble of a garbage truck down the street, birds chirping outside the window, the whir of a lawnmower starting up 2 houses over. By mid-morning, the heat would settle in, heavy but alive. Every neighborhood had its gathering spot, maybe a cul-de-sac with a basketball hoop nailed to a garage, maybe a patch of woods that served as a secret fort. We built entire worlds out of scrap wood and imagination. Old doors became walls. Cardboard boxes became castles. And when the sun grew too hot, someone would drag a hose into the street, twist it into a sprinkler, and that was all the adventure you needed. Kids ran through the spray, shouting and laughing until the pavement shimmered with puddles. There was something pure in that kind of joy. No planning, no screens, no reason other than because it's fun. And then there were the pools, turquoise rectangles of summer magic. You could hear them before you saw them. The sharp splash, the lifeguard's whistle, the radio playing Surfin' USA on repeat. The air smelled like sunscreen and popsicles, the kind that dripped down your wrist faster than you could lick them. We'd dive, splash, float on our backs, watching the sky blur through wet eyelashes. Hours disappeared there. Friendships were made and tested in games of Marco Polo, and every crush started with a splash fight that lasted just a little too long. When the sun began to fade, the town changed color. Everything turned honey orange, then soft pink, then that deep blue before the streetlights flickered on. You could smell dinner everywhere, grilled burgers, corn on the cob, something sweet baking somewhere nearby. Kids would head home, leaving trails of wet footprints across driveways. Screen doors slammed. The world quieted again, but it was a good quiet, the kind that meant everyone was exactly where they should be. Nights in summer carried their own rhythm. You'd sit on the porch, still in your swimsuit, hair damp, skin warm. The adults talked softly about the neighbors, about work, about the moon landing they hoped to see soon. Someone might turn on a transistor radio, its tiny speaker buzzing out under the boardwalk, or Can't Take My Eyes Off You. Fireflies blinked in the yard like tiny floating lights, and somewhere down the street, you could hear the creak of a swing set still moving from the last game of the day. And on some nights, the drive-in theater called everyone together. Families packed into cars with blankets and popcorn in paper bags. The giant white screen loomed under the stars, and when the movie started, maybe the sound of music or the Pink Panther, it felt like magic. The sound crackled through metal speakers that hooked to your window, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and exhaust. Kids sat on the roof of cars, legs dangling, whispering to each other as the movie flickered across their faces. Couples held hands in the back seats. Parents sipped sodas and leaned back, watching both the film and the stars above it. When the credits rolled, no one rushed to leave. The cars started one by one, headlights flashing across the lot, and for a few minutes, the world looked like a slow-moving constellation. Back home, you'd crawl into bed with your hair still smelling faintly of chlorine and the night air. The sheets were cool. The window cracked open just enough to let in the sound of crickets. You could hear the soft hum of the fan turning rhythmically, the faint clatter of a neighbor's car, door closing for the last time that day. Everything felt still, suspended, as if the world itself wanted to stay quiet so you could fall asleep peacefully. Those summer nights felt endless, like they'd keep repeating forever. Each one melted into the next, a blur of sunlight, laughter, and gentle exhaustion. The 60s didn't just give us color TV and rock and roll. They gave us stillness, connection, and time to truly feel the world around us. Back then, happiness didn't come from anything you could buy or post or capture. It came from the sound of a baseball bat hitting a ball at sunset, the taste of lemonade after mowing the lawn, the glow of lightning bugs in the yard, and the feeling of knowing that tomorrow would be just as good as today. And even now, when I think of those summers, I can still hear the echo of it. The laughter fading into twilight, the soft whistle of the breeze through open windows, and that unmistakable hum of a world alive, but never in a hurry. Autumn in the 1960s came gently, like the world itself was exhaling after a long, bright summer. The heat faded slowly, replaced by the crisp scent of leaves turning brittle underfoot. The mornings grew quieter, the air cooler and sharper. You could see your breath in the early hours, small clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The rhythm of life shifted again. The pools emptied, the sprinklers were rolled up, and the bicycles leaned untouched in the garages. It was time for sweaters, thermoses, and the comforting creak of school doors opening for another year. The first days of school always felt special. The hallways smelled of chalk and floor wax, the desks cool to the touch. New notebooks with perfectly clean pages waited to be filled, and pencils were sharpened down to perfect points. Teachers stood at the front with hair perfectly set, voices calm but firm, calling roll from handwritten lists. There were no digital bells or announcements, just the clang of the old wall clock and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. You could feel the weight of the new year in the air, the promise of new friends, new books, maybe a new crush sitting 2 rows over. Outside, the world began to change color. Lawns lost their bright green, replaced by yellows and golds. The trees blazed with fiery reds, oranges, and deep browns, and when the wind blew, the air filled with a shower of leaves tumbling down like slow-motion confetti. The streets became playgrounds again, covered in crunchy piles that begged to be jumped into. Every sound was softer, the scuff of shoes on the sidewalk, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant school bell. There was beauty in the slowness, in watching nature turn over its colors and prepare for rest. At home, the evenings carried a new kind of warmth. The scent of cinnamon, apples, and wood smoke drifted through neighborhoods. Mothers pulled out heavy pots for soups and stews, recipes that had been tucked away all summer. The kitchen windows fogged with steam as radios hummed softly in the background, playing Sinatra or the Mamas and the Papas. Dinner felt heartier somehow. Pot roast, baked bread, pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. Every bite seemed to say, "We're home again." Sundays in the fall were sacred in their own way. The day began with the sound of football games on the television, the crowd roaring through the speakers. Dad sat in recliners, sleeves rolled up, shouting advice at players who couldn't hear them. Kids sprawled on the floor with comic books, the TV glow flickering across their faces. The clatter of dishes came from the kitchen, and every so often, the smell of something roasting would drift into the living room, reminding everyone that dinner wasn't far off. It wasn't about sports, really, it was about ritual, about belonging to something that felt larger than yourself. Outside, the air was electric. You could hear rakes scraping across driveways, the rustle of leaves being gathered into piles, the distant laughter of neighbors catching up. Jack-o'-lanterns appeared on porches as Halloween crept closer. The excitement was simple, pure, picking out a costume, carving a pumpkin by hand, saving brown paper grocery bags for trick-or-treating. Kids would run from house to house, pillowcases slung over their shoulders, shouting into the night as porch lights flicked on one by one. The cold air bit at their cheeks, and the smell of burning leaves followed them everywhere. When the nights came earlier, families gathered closer. The glow from the TV or the fireplace filled the room, the rest of the world fading into quiet darkness. Board games came out, cards shuffled, popcorn popped on the stove. Someone might pull out a stack of photo albums, black and white snapshots tucked into plastic sleeves, and tell stories that had already been told a dozen times. Laughter would echo, soft and familiar, and for a moment, the house would feel fuller than it actually was. Autumn had a way of making everything feel more grounded. You'd walk home under streetlights glowing through fog, your hands in your pockets, the air carrying the faintest smell of chimney smoke. You'd hear your own footsteps, steady and soft, and think about how the seasons kept their promises, summer into fall, fall into winter, just like always. Life was simple, but never dull. The small things, the scratch of wool on your neck, the crunch of an apple, the flicker of leaves in a gust of wind, they had meaning because you noticed them. That was the essence of those years, not the big events or the headlines, but the texture of life itself. The taste of cold air, the weight of a wool coat, the sound of laughter spilling into the evening. The 60s had a soul, a heartbeat that matched the turning of the seasons. It wasn't fast or loud. It was steady, deliberate, alive. And even now, when autumn comes around again, when I smell smoke in the air and see the first leaves fall, it feels like the world is whispering the same quiet message it did back then. Slow down, look around, and be here just for a moment longer. Winter in the 1960s carried a beauty that you could feel more than see. The air turned still, and the world seemed to hush itself under a blanket of white. Mornings started slower, darker, the kind where you could see your breath fog the cold glass before you even pulled back the curtains. The sound of the furnace coming to life was almost comforting, that low, steady hum that promised warmth. Outside, rooftops were edged with frost, car windows etched with patterns so delicate they looked hand-drawn. You could smell the cold, sharp, clean, honest. It was the kind of chill that woke you completely, that reminded you the seasons still held power. Snow had a rhythm of its own. The first flakes always brought silence. Streets went quiet, the world turning soft and pale. Kids pressed their faces to windows, waiting for the flakes to thicken. Schools would announce closures over the radio, and the cheers that followed could probably be heard across town. Boots and scarves appeared from closets, and within minutes, the streets came alive again. Snowball fights in driveways, sleds pulled to the top of small neighborhood hills, laughter echoing against the cold air. It wasn't just a day off. It was freedom, the kind that belonged only to childhood, when time didn't matter and the world was your playground. Inside, everything felt warmer than ever. The smell of wet mittens drying on the radiator, cocoa steaming in chipped mugs, and wool blankets draped over chairs. Families gathered in the living room, socks pulled up high, sweaters thick and soft. The television played holiday specials: A Charlie Brown Christmas, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and everyone, no matter their age, watched like it was brand new every year. There was no streaming, no rewind, no replay. You either caught it or you missed it. That made it special, fleeting, and alive, something that belonged to that night only. The holidays came with a kind of magic that couldn't be manufactured. Christmas lights blinked softly in frosted windows, their glow reflected in puddles of melted snow. Neighbors greeted each other with small gifts: homemade fudge, tins of cookies, maybe a card with a handwritten note. The town square would string lights across the main street, and the local hardware store would paint snowflakes on the windows. You could smell pine from the trees being sold in lots, carried home strapped to the roofs of cars. Inside the houses, the scent of tinsel, pine needles, and sugar cookies blended into something unforgettable, something that felt like belonging. Shopping for gifts meant walking through crowded stores with gloved hands and red cheeks. The aisles were alive with music: the Ronettes, Elvis, Andy Williams, and every display sparkled with promise. You didn't need a list on a phone. You carried it in your head, thinking about faces, smiles, and surprises. There was joy in the hunt, in finding something just right and imagining the moment it would be unwrapped. It wasn't about what you bought. It was about the thought that went into it. When Christmas morning finally came, it arrived not with noise, but with stillness. The house was quiet before the excitement began. Just the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint scent of pine, the hush that hangs before dawn. Then, little by little, footsteps on the stairs. The sound of paper tearing, the gasp of surprise, the laughter that followed. Parents with coffee mugs in hand, watching, smiling. The record spun softly in the background. White Christmas, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. Songs that seemed made for mornings like that. And then, after the rush faded, came the quiet again. The sound of a toy train circling the tree. The smell of breakfast, pancakes and bacon and maple syrup. Snow still falling outside, slow and endless. The world felt new, clean, full of hope. There was no rush to post a picture, no distraction to chase. The day unfolded at its own pace, as if time itself was willing to wait. By evening, the lights dimmed again. The wrapping paper was gathered, the dishes were done, and the fire burned low. The family sat together, content in a kind of silence that spoke volumes. Maybe someone would flip through a new book, or put together a puzzle, or just stare into the fire. The warmth wasn't just from the flames. It was from the togetherness, the shared moment that needed nothing more than itself. That's what winter meant back then. Not just cold and snow, but connection. The soft hum of life continuing even as the world outside froze. It was the season of reflection, of gratitude, of slowness. You noticed the small things, the sound of footsteps in fresh snow, the taste of cocoa that was a little too hot, the glow of the street lamp through falling flakes. Those were the moments that built a lifetime. And though the world kept changing, those winter nights, that peace, that warmth, stayed the same, echoing quietly in memory, like the faint sound of a record spinning long after the music has stopped. Spring in the 1960s felt like a reset button on life, like the whole world was stretching after a long nap. The snow melted slowly, trickling down the edges of driveways into tiny rivers that kids would chase with sticks. The air changed first, lighter, cleaner, full of the faint smell of rain and thawing earth. You could hear birds again, singing from the bare trees that had stood silent all winter. The sun climbed a little higher each day, and suddenly the shadows didn't seem so long anymore. Everything felt new, even things that had been there forever. The first real sign of spring was the sound of the screen door slamming again. After months of being sealed inside, people returned to the outdoors like they were rediscovering it. Lawns woke up from their dull brown and started to green, and men in white t-shirts pushed lawnmowers that sputtered back to life after months of rest. The smell of fresh-cut grass carried through the neighborhood like a promise that summer wasn't far off. Women opened the windows, letting the breeze roll through the house, carrying out the last traces of winter, the dust, the heaviness, the quiet. Curtains billowed softly, floors squeaked under the mop, and everything smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and air. You could feel the whole neighborhood coming alive again. Kids played hopscotch on sidewalks drawn with new chalk, the pastel colors standing bright against the gray concrete. Bikes returned to the streets, their tires still soft from months of sitting idle. Baseball gloves were dug out of closets, their leather stiff and dry, ready to be oiled again. The first crack of a bat in an empty lot was the sound of a season beginning. Sundays meant church picnics and lemonade. Families gathered under budding trees with checkered blankets and wicker baskets. There was laughter again, movement again, hope again. Spring was also the season of renewal inside the home. Every family had their own version of spring cleaning, a ritual that seemed to have as much to do with spirit as with dust. Windows were washed until they sparkled, rugs were hung outside and beaten clean, closets were sorted, drawers emptied. It wasn't about throwing things away. It was about making space, resetting the energy. You could hear radios playing in every room while people worked, each song marking another step toward freshness. Downtown by Petula Clark, Can't Buy Me Love, My Girl. Songs that made even the smallest chore feel light. And with the warmth came fashion, brighter colors, lighter fabrics. Men traded their heavy coats for crisp shirts with rolled sleeves. Women wore sleeveless dresses with floral patterns, hair tied back in scarves that fluttered in the breeze. Even the air seemed to sparkle more when people smiled again. There was something deeply human about it. This shedding of layers, both literal and emotional, this return to openness. The 1960s were already an age of change, but in spring, that change felt gentle, like nature itself was showing how to start over without losing what came before. The evenings stretched longer, painted in pink and gold. The streets filled with the sound of jump ropes hitting pavement, screen doors creaking, and someone's radio playing faintly through an open window. Neighbors leaned over fences, trading stories, admiring gardens that were just beginning to bloom. Daffodils, tulips, lilacs, colors that reminded you the world could make something beautiful out of anything, even the hardest winter. Spring storms had their own kind of poetry. You'd see the sky darken in the distance, the air go heavy with that unmistakable smell of rain before it fell. The first drops would hit the sidewalk, leaving perfect little circles that grew into rivers running down the gutters. Thunder would rumble far away, and everyone would pause for a moment, not in fear, but in awe. Rain wasn't an interruption, it was a performance. Kids ran outside barefoot, daring each other to stay in it, laughing as they got soaked. And when it was over, the air felt brand new again, cleaner, alive, carrying the scent of wet earth and fresh beginnings. There was a peace in those days, a rhythm that tied every person, every home, every sound together. The world wasn't about racing ahead. It was about being present in the small things that changed right before your eyes. A tree blooming overnight, a radio song that drifted in from a neighbor's window, the feeling of grass finally soft again under bare feet. Spring in the 1960s wasn't about renewal in some grand, poetic sense. It was about life, quiet, simple, real life, returning in all its forms. And maybe that's why it stays so clear in memory. Because every year, no matter how much time has passed, when the air shifts, when the first flowers push through the soil, and when sunlight hits the world at just the right angle, it feels the same. Like stepping back into a moment that never really ended. A time when everything was slower, gentler, and the future felt bright enough to touch. By the late 1960s, you could feel the world beginning to hum differently. Not louder, not necessarily faster yet, but with a new kind of energy. Life still carried that same slow rhythm of home-cooked meals, neighborhood barbecues, and Saturday night TV, but there was a spark in the air now. You could sense it in the colors of clothing, in the lyrics of songs, in the way people started to talk about dreams that were bigger than their towns. It wasn't rebellion yet, not entirely. It was curiosity. A generation waking up to the idea that life could be more than routines, more than fences and quiet streets. It showed first in the music. Radios played everything from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to Simon and Garfunkel and the Mamas and the Papas. Every song felt like a doorway into something new, freedom, love, possibility. You could hear that change in how people moved, how they dressed, even how they thought. Guitars replaced pianos in living rooms. Record players became the centerpiece of gatherings. You'd stack a few vinyls, drop the needle, and the night would begin. Friends would sit cross-legged on shag carpets, talking softly, nodding to the rhythm. For the first time, it felt like the music wasn't just background. It meant something. It gave people language for feelings they didn't know how to explain. You could see the change in style, too. The prim and polished look of the early 60s started to fade, replaced by something looser, more expressive. Bright colors, bold patterns, bell-bottom pants, suede jackets, long hair. It was all a statement, even if no one said exactly what it meant. Clothes stopped being just clothes. They became symbols of who you were, what you believed, or maybe just how free you wanted to feel. For the first time, fashion didn't trickle down from designers. It grew from the streets, from teenagers, from the music itself. Television reflected it too. The black and white world had fully given way to color, and with it came new stories, new faces, new ideas. Variety shows mixed music with comedy. Sitcoms became more daring, and commercials grew brighter and catchier. The whole country was learning how to look at itself differently, more vibrant, more open. Even the way people spoke on TV shifted. The tone was less formal, more conversational. The stiff politeness of the 1950s was melting away, replaced by something honest, raw, real. But despite the changes, life at home still had that familiar heartbeat. Families still gathered for dinner, still watched the news together, still took drives on Sunday afternoons. The evening news became a bridge between the world outside and the world inside. You'd see astronauts floating in space, students marching in the streets, and music festivals that seemed almost otherworldly. Woodstock, Monterey, the Summer of Love. It all felt far away and yet deeply personal. Even if you didn't go, you felt part of it somehow, like the country was sharing one long, strange dream. There was optimism in the air, but also uncertainty. Parents didn't always understand the changes their kids embraced, and kids didn't always know how to explain them. But there was love there, under all the confusion. Families still gathered around Thanksgiving tables, still decorated trees together, still waved from driveways as someone headed off to college or the army. Life remained anchored by small, steady rituals, even as the world beyond the front porch seemed to tilt in new directions. Technology began sneaking its way into daily life too, though no one saw it as revolutionary yet. Portable cassette players, color TVs, Polaroid cameras, little wonders that made everything feel immediate. For the first time, you could take a picture and hold it in your hands just minutes later. The thrill of watching an image slowly appear, ghost-like, out of white paper never got old. Every photograph was a memory frozen in real time, tangible and precious. The cars of those years said everything about the era, loud, proud, gleaming with chrome and confidence. Mustangs, Camaros, and Corvettes roared through neighborhoods that had once been quiet. Teenagers worked part-time jobs just to afford one. The freedom of driving, windows down, music blasting, nothing but the road ahead, became a symbol of youth itself. You weren't just going somewhere, you were becoming someone. Yet even with all that change, the core of life remained simple. Families still watched fireworks on the 4th of July, still shared lemonade on porches, still mowed their lawns on Saturdays. The world outside was changing, but inside, the heartbeat of everyday life stayed strong. That's what made the 1960s so extraordinary. It held two worlds at once, the old and the new, tradition and transformation, the comforting hum of the past, and the electric crackle of the future just beginning to form. Looking back now, It's easy to see that the decade was more than just a time of peace signs and pop songs. It was the moment when the world learned to dream bigger, when ordinary life and extraordinary hope shared the same table. It was the sound of a record spinning, the sight of color TV flickering in a dark room, the scent of gasoline on a summer night, and the feeling that tomorrow could be something entirely new. By the end of the 1960s, the world didn't just look different, it felt different. The air itself seemed charged, humming with invention and possibility. The quiet, predictable rhythm of the early part of the decade had given way to something alive and restless. You could sense it in everything, in the conversations, the headlines, the way people carried themselves. Change wasn't coming anymore. It had arrived, but it wasn't the kind that tore life apart. Not yet. It was the kind that made you look up from your routines and realize that you were standing in the middle of a brand new era, one that glowed like the static on a TV screen just before the picture came into focus. Technology was part of that glow. The television wasn't just a box in the living room anymore. It had become a window to the entire world. News no longer felt distant or delayed. It arrived right there, in real time. You could see rockets taking off, soldiers marching, crowds cheering. You could watch history instead of just reading about it in the morning paper. The moon landing was the perfect example of that. July 1969. Families gathered around their TVs, not just in America, but across the globe, eyes fixed on a grainy black and white image of a man stepping onto another world. One small step for man. The sound of those words, the silence that followed, the collective breath of wonder. It's hard to describe how it felt. It wasn't about politics or science. It was about being human. For one night, the world seemed to pause together, united in awe of what was possible. That same year, music was evolving into something almost spiritual. The Beatles had gone from love songs to revolution, from simple harmonies to entire landscapes of sound. The radio played everything: Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Creedence Clearwater Revival, a mix of rebellion, beauty, and raw emotion that could shake your bones or break your heart. Songs weren't just entertainment, they were reflections of the times. They carried the world's questions, hopes, and contradictions. You could drive down a quiet road at sunset with the windows open, and the music would blend with the wind, the hum of the tires, and the golden light. It felt like you were driving through the soundtrack of history. In small towns, though, the heartbeat of ordinary life stayed steady. The corner diner still smelled like coffee and bacon in the mornings. The jukebox still played Hey Jude for a dime. Men still gathered at gas stations to talk about the weather, cars, or baseball. Kids still tossed newspapers onto porches before sunrise. The beauty of the 1960s was how both worlds, the old and the new, managed to live side by side for a while. You could be watching the moon landing in the evening and mowing your lawn the next morning, still thinking about the stars. There was an innocence to how people believed in the future then. They trusted that tomorrow would always bring something better: a faster car, a smaller radio, a cure for something that seemed impossible. Optimism was everywhere, painted across magazine covers, sung through transistor radios, printed on cereal boxes that promised the breakfast of the space age. The future had a scent: ozone, fresh paint, metal, and possibility. Yet for all its progress, life never lost its human warmth. Family dinners still mattered. Friends still dropped by unannounced. Kids still played outside until the streetlights came on. Love was still handwritten, in letters, in postcards, in notes folded carefully into pockets. And though the world was learning to look outward, to space, to technology, to the promise of what could be, the heart of it all remained simple. People still needed connection, laughter, belonging. The same things that made the 1950s gentle made the 1960s unforgettable. Humanity wrapped inside wonder. And that's what made those final years of the decade so powerful. They carried the echoes of the old world, the comfort, the traditions, the shared stillness. But they also carried a spark of something daring, a belief that we could rewrite everything, that the world could be kinder, freer, more colorful. It was the last time innocence and innovation danced together so easily. When I think back on it now, what I remember most isn't the headlines or the inventions. It's the way the light fell on everything, the way vinyl records gleamed under the lamp, the way people looked at each other, curious, open, hopeful. The 1960s weren't just a decade. They were a turning point between the world that was and the world that would come after. A place where you could still feel safe, but also feel the tremors of something vast awakening beneath your feet. And when the decade finally gave way to the 70s, it didn't end with a crash. It faded slowly, like the last note of a song that you never wanted to stop playing. The air was still full of music, the sky still full of dreams, and the people, even the ordinary ones, sitting on porches or standing in driveways. They knew, somehow, that they had lived through something that would never come again. When I think of how the 1960s closed, I don't remember a single moment or event. I remember a feeling. The sense that something enormous had just happened, even if you couldn't quite put your finger on it. It was as if the entire world had taken a deep breath, stood still for a heartbeat, and then began exhaling into a new kind of life. The decade didn't end with a bang, not really. It ended quietly, with tired smiles, soft music still echoing in living rooms, and a kind of peaceful exhaustion that comes after realizing you've witnessed the turning of an age. Everywhere you looked, there were signs that the world had grown up a little. The children who had started the decade playing with hula hoops and toy rockets were suddenly teenagers, with guitars and strong opinions. The parents who once trusted everything on the evening news were starting to ask questions. And through it all, the same familiar things: the cars, the houses, the diners, the laughter, they remained. But they felt different now, touched by awareness. You could sense that the innocence of the early 60s had faded, replaced by a quiet wisdom. Television carried that transformation. In the beginning, it was all about perfect sitcom families, shiny kitchens, and cheerful jingles. By the end, the images had changed: astronauts floating in silence, crowds holding signs, soldiers far from home. People no longer just watched television, they felt it. The screen had become a mirror, and the reflections were complex. Hope, pride, fear, beauty, sadness, all tangled together in the same black and white glow. But even in those complicated images, there was still connection. Everyone, everywhere, was watching together. That shared experience was its own kind of glue, fragile, but strong enough to hold. At home, life still ran on familiar tracks. The kitchen was still the warmest place in the house. The living room still where stories were told. Dinner still meant being together. Parents still asked about school, and kids still mumbled answers between bites of mashed potatoes. There were arguments, of course, generational ones, political ones, but they were all built on love, on the hope that the other side would listen. And they usually did, because despite all the noise outside, inside those houses, people still believed in each other. The cars of those last years seemed to reflect the decade's dual spirit, sleek, shining machines that promised adventure, yet heavy enough to feel grounded. People drove to the beach, to the drive-in, to nowhere in particular, just to listen to the radio and feel the world moving beneath them. Gas was cheap, roads were open, and the horizon always seemed to be calling. You could roll the windows down, let the wind whip through your hair, and for a few minutes believe that anything was possible. Neighborhoods still had that heartbeat, the one that pulsed through every backyard barbecue, every little league game, every Friday night when porch lights glowed like stars. You knew the people who lived next door, you borrowed sugar, you waved to the mailman. There was safety in that routine, a shared rhythm that felt unbreakable. Even as society stretched and shifted, those small, everyday rituals kept everyone anchored. And then there was the music, always the music. By 1969, it had woven itself into every part of life. It wasn't background anymore. It was expression, reflection, revelation. You could find yourself in a song, lose yourself in another. From the haunting opening chords of A Wider Shade of Pale to the raw truth of Fortunate Son, the music told stories no one else knew how to tell. It carried people through joy and through loss. It became the memory of the decade itself, the pulse of its spirit captured forever in melody and rhythm. Even as the 70s approached, the 60s refused to vanish. You could still feel it in the smell of vinyl records, in the glow of neon signs outside diners, in the laughter echoing from roller rinks and bowling alleys. The world was changing, yes, but the core remained. Families, music, community, the belief that life could always be better than it was. The 60s had given people something priceless, a taste of progress and the courage to believe in it. When you look back, what stands out isn't the politics or the protests or even the moon landing. It's the feeling of being alive in a world that was discovering itself. The feeling of standing in your driveway on a warm evening, hearing a distant song, smelling the cut grass, seeing the glow of televisions through windows up and down the street, and knowing that you were part of something. Not a movement, not a headline, but a shared moment in time. That's how the decade really ended. Not with fireworks or farewells, but with the quiet, steady continuation of life. A mother turning off the porch light, a father locking the door, a record player spinning in the next room, the needle gently crackling as the music faded. The 1960s drifted out like the last note of a favorite song. Warm, familiar, beautiful, leaving behind an echo that would never really stop. Looking back now, the 1960s feel almost like a dream that the world once had. Vivid, colorful, full of noise and heart, but somehow softer around the edges. The years that followed became faster, louder, busier, but the 60s, they still move slowly in memory. They breathe. You can still feel their pulse if you stop long enough. In the way vinyl sounds when the needle first hits the groove, in the warmth of a photograph fading on the fridge, in the smell of an old car interior on a hot day. It's not nostalgia for one moment, but for a whole rhythm of living that seems almost impossible now. Maybe that's why people still look back on that decade with such tenderness. Because for all the change, for all the turmoil and transformation, the 1960s were full of presence. People lived in the world instead of looking at it through screens. They talked face to face, listened without distraction, and when they did something, a conversation, a song, a meal, it held their full attention. Even boredom back then had its place. Sitting on a porch swing, watching the sky turn orange, just thinking. Doing nothing was a part of life, and somehow it filled you up instead of making you restless. The sounds of the decade never really fade. You can still hear them if you close your eyes. The clack of typewriter keys, the buzz of a lawnmower on Saturday morning, the hiss of a record spinning after the song ends. Radios hummed everywhere, in kitchens, in garages, in cars parked under starlit skies. Those songs stitched the decade together, one chorus at a time. When you hear them now, the Beatles, the Supremes, the Doors, the Beach Boys, they don't just play, they reappear. You're right back there, barefoot on the kitchen linoleum, humming along while your parents dance slowly, quietly, in the dim yellow light. The sights were just as distinct, the pastel cars, the chrome diners, the bold patterns of the clothes. There was color everywhere, not just in things, but in the way people expressed themselves. Even the houses reflected it, cheerful yellows, mint greens, pale blues. Front lawns trimmed just right, mailboxes painted to match. Life looked cared for. People took pride in things because they lasted, and when something broke, you fixed it. When something wore out, you mended it. There was a kind of dignity in the everyday, the way a father polished his shoes before work, or a mother pressed the collar of a shirt until it looked perfect again. The little rituals that said, "We take care of what's ours." But maybe the strongest memory of the 60s isn't a sound or a color, it's a feeling. That sense of togetherness that lived in everything. Neighbors knew each other. Kids roamed in packs and came home when the streetlights turned on. People showed up for one another, with casseroles, with jumper cables, with advice, with time. If you were sick, someone knocked on your door with soup. If you needed a hand, it was offered without being asked for. That closeness wasn't planned or organized. It was natural, born out of a slower world where you had the space to notice other people. There's something almost sacred about that simplicity. No one thought of it as special at the time. It was just life. But that's the thing about the 60s. The beauty of it wasn't in grand gestures or headlines. It was in small moments, sitting on a porch after dinner, flipping through a Sears catalog, listening to the hum of crickets. It was the shared quiet after a long day, the comfort of routine, the weight of the world reduced to what fit in your hands. Sometimes, I wonder if that's why the decade never really left us. Because even as everything changed, the technology, the pace, the expectations, something inside us still longs for that slower heartbeat. We still chase that feeling, even if we don't call it by name. That deep, calm knowing that the world is spinning at just the right speed, and that we're exactly where we're supposed to be. And maybe that's what nostalgia really is. Not a wish to go back, but a gratitude for having lived it at all. For having seen the world when it was smaller, gentler, and full of unspoken wonder. The 1960s weren't perfect. No time ever is. But they were alive. They were real. And in their rhythm, in their warmth, in the way they moved without hurry, they left behind something that still glows quietly in all of us. That faint hum of memory, like a record still turning long after the song has ended. The 1960s ended more than half a century ago, yet they still live somewhere deep inside the collective memory, not as a history lesson, but as a feeling. You can almost sense it, like a faint vibration beneath the surface of the modern world. Every time a Beatles song plays in a grocery store, every time a vintage car glides through traffic, every time someone pulls out an old photograph with rounded corners and soft colors, the air changes for just a second. You can almost smell it again. The faint sweetness of vinyl, the tang of gasoline, the clean scent of soap that clung to every freshly ironed shirt. That's the thing about the 60s. They don't just come back as pictures or facts. They return as sensations. If you lived through that time, or even if you've only heard stories from those who did, you know that life had texture. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't simple in the way nostalgia sometimes pretends, but it was tangible. You could feel it under your fingertips, the ridges of a rotary phone dial, the heavy click of a typewriter key, the firm snap of a car door that was built to last. Even the small inconveniences felt human. You waited for film to be developed. You tuned the radio by ear. You turned the TV antenna by hand while someone inside shouted, "That's good. Stop there." Everything took time, and somehow that made it matter more. The cities of the 1960s buzzed differently than they do now. There was less noise, but more life. Cafes filled with cigarette smoke and laughter. Department stores glowing with polished brass and polished manners. Downtown movie theaters with marquees so bright they could light up half a block. You'd hear the muffled roar of traffic mixed with the sharp ring of a streetcar bell. And over it all, somewhere close, a busker's guitar strumming out the same few chords over and over. The world felt wide open, but still local, big enough to dream in, small enough to belong to. In the suburbs, time unfolded in slower layers. Kids played kickball in the street. Mothers leaned on fences to talk. Fathers mowed lawns in careful lines. The air always seemed to carry a faint hum, of sprinklers ticking, of bees drifting lazily between clover patches, of someone's radio playing California Dreamin' from a garage. Families gathered around backyard grills, paper plates balanced on laps, fireflies blinking in the dusk. You didn't need much to feel content. A lawn chair, a breeze, a glass of lemonade sweating on the armrest, those were enough. Happiness wasn't hunted. It arrived quietly, like an evening breeze. The world outside those neighborhoods, though, was changing faster than anyone could believe. The 60s taught people that progress and peace could exist side by side with uncertainty and unrest. It was a decade of contradictions, love and war, laughter and fear, rebellion and routine. But maybe that's why it lingers so powerfully. It was the last time the future still felt personal. Not a thing you scrolled past or consumed, but something you helped build, step by step, invention by invention, song by song. People believed in the promise of better, and they worked for it with both hands. The family photo albums from that time tell the story best. The slightly faded Kodachrome colors, the grainy smiles, the children squinting in the sun. Behind each picture is a kind of quiet pride. Life wasn't about perfection, it was about participation. You showed up for it. You planted gardens, you fixed things when they broke, you waved to neighbors whether you liked them or not. You measured your days not by what you owned, but by what you made, what you gave, and who you spent your time with. Today, when people talk about wanting to go back, I don't think they mean they miss the exact year or the clothes or even the music, though all of that helps paint the picture. I think they miss the feeling of enough. Enough time, enough closeness, enough peace to just exist without proving anything. The 60s were full of flaws, but they also held that rare sense of balance. A world learning how to grow, yet still grounded in connection. And so the decade endures, not because of what it invented or destroyed, but because of what it remembered. That joy could be ordinary. That kindness could be daily. That life, when lived fully and simply, could be enough. It's there in the old photographs, in the soft grain of old film reels, in the glow of lava lamps and the laughter caught on home recordings. The 60s whisper through time, not asking to be relived, only to be remembered, because they remind us that for one shining moment, the world moved slower. People looked each other in the eye, and life, even in its smallest details, felt like something sacred. Even now, so many years later, the world built in the 1960s still lingers in the corners of our daily lives. You see it in the way a certain shade of turquoise makes you think of diner booths. You hear it when an old song slips through a radio station and, for a heartbeat, the present folds into the past. It's there in the way some streets still look. The same rows of modest houses with carports and mailboxes that tilt slightly. The same sidewalks edged with maples that were just saplings back then. The world has changed, yes, but the echoes of that decade remain. like faint fingerprints pressed into everything we still touch. What's striking about the 60s isn't just what people had, but how they treated what they had. Things were built to last, and so were habits. If a toaster broke, someone took it apart on the kitchen table and fixed it. If a button fell off a coat, it was sewn back on that same night. There was an unspoken pride in maintenance, in care. Objects felt personal because they carried the marks of use. A scratch on a record, a dent in the car bumper, a pencil mark in the margin of a favorite book. Every imperfection told a story. Life had wear and tear, and that was part of its charm. There was also a patience that's almost unrecognizable now. Letters took days to arrive, photos took weeks to develop, and movies stayed in theaters for months instead of disappearing after a weekend. People waited, and in that waiting, they found meaning. The world taught you to savor anticipation, to understand that some things needed time to be worth anything at all. The 1960s were full of that kind of stillness, a slow, steady pace that allowed every sound, every face, every season to leave a mark. The kitchens of that time were the center of everything. Yellow countertops, patterned linoleum, rounded refrigerators humming in the corner. You'd hear the rhythmic chop of vegetables, the sound of a radio playing in the background, the laughter of a conversation that wandered wherever it wanted to go. Meals were made from scratch not because of a trend, but because that's just how things were done. The smell of pot roast, the sight of rising steam on cold windows, the clatter of dishes being set out. Those small rituals stitched families together more tightly than they realized. The streets themselves carried a personality too. You could smell the world differently back then. Gasoline had a sweetness to it. Rain on pavement smelled sharper. Even the dust in summer air felt alive. Car tires made a low hum on the road, the kind that lulled you to sleep in the back seat during long drives. You could stick your arm out the window and feel the wind ripple through your fingers, the air warm but alive with movement. The horizon felt closer somehow, not because the world was smaller, but because it was slower, more reachable. Evenings were a quiet symphony. The soft flicker of lamps behind curtains, the faint blue glow of television sets, the hum of crickets in the grass. People walked after dinner. No phones, no music, just footsteps and voices under the streetlights. You'd hear snippets of conversation, laughter from porches, the distant whistle of a train heading somewhere unknown. Every neighborhood had its own rhythm, its own pulse. And when you looked up, the sky seemed endless. The stars were brighter, not because the universe was any different, but because fewer things competed for your attention. There's something tender about how the 1960s managed to balance progress with peace. It was a decade that dreamed big, reaching for the moon, but still found joy in the small. It taught people to believe in better tomorrows without losing sight of the quiet pleasures of today. The smell of bread baking, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the warmth of a blanket pulled fresh from the line. For all its ambition, the 60s never forgot to look inward, to appreciate what was already there. Maybe that's the lesson that still hums beneath all the nostalgia. Not that things were easier or purer back then, but that they were more felt. Life was lived through the senses, through presence, through patience. People didn't rush through moments, they rested in them. And even now, as the world spins faster and faster, that memory lingers like an open door. The 1960s whisper to us that life doesn't have to be perfect to be beautiful. It just has to be noticed. Because in the end, that's what that decade really gave us. An awareness that ordinary life, with all its small sounds and simple joys, is enough. The smell of coffee in the morning, the scratch of a record, the warmth of a hand resting on yours. Those were the miracles of the 60s, and maybe they still are, waiting quietly, right where we left them. There's something about remembering the 1960s that makes the world seem a little slower, a little softer, as if time itself had texture back then. Days weren't measured in notifications or deadlines. They unfolded like pages in a book. You didn't skim through them. You read every line. Morning started not with a buzz or a glow, but with light. Sunlight creeping across the floorboards, warming the wooden edges of furniture, brushing over framed photos that already looked nostalgic even then. The house came alive gradually. The faint whistle of the kettle, the shuffle of slippers on tile, the low hum of the refrigerator. Nothing happened all at once. Life, even at its busiest, still had pauses built into it. People noticed those pauses. They filled them with small things, a chat over the fence, a cup of coffee on the porch, a few moments just sitting by the window, watching clouds move like ships across the sky. The world outside wasn't a blur of motion yet. You could stand on your front step and actually hear the day, birds in the distance, the faint rattle of a truck on the next street over, the metallic clang of a mailbox closing. Everything seemed to breathe in rhythm with you. The world wasn't trying to outrun itself. It was simply there, steady and familiar. Even the air felt different. The smell of gasoline mixed with the sweetness of cut grass. The tang of rain on warm concrete. The faint drift of cigarette smoke curling in the evening air. These were the scents of ordinary life, but they felt alive, because every sense was awake, unfiltered. You could hear the world in layers. The chatter of voices at the grocery store, the jingle of the doorbell at the diner, the soft spin of a record in the next room. Silence wasn't emptiness, it was rest. It was space between things, a moment for everything to settle before the next note began. Inside the homes, everything carried warmth. Furniture was heavy, solid, built to endure. Curtains were always half open, letting sunlight wash the walls in soft amber tones. Magazines lay open on the coffee table. Life, look, National Geographic, showing a world that felt impossibly big and yet still reachable. The television, still glowing in the corner, was more than entertainment. It was a member of the household, a storyteller, a teacher, sometimes a witness. Family sat close, eyes fixed on that small window into everywhere. They didn't just watch the world, they believed in it. When you think about it, that's what the 60s really gave us, belief. Belief in tomorrow, in each other, in the idea that progress could be made by ordinary people doing ordinary things. You could feel it even in the smallest gestures. A man tipping his hat to a stranger. A teacher writing a word neatly on a chalkboard. A mother hanging clothes on the line. The fabric snapping in the breeze like sails on some unseen voyage. The entire world seemed to run on quiet confidence, the kind that said, "We're building something, and it's going to be good." Of course, there was turmoil. No decade is free of it. But even in the unrest, there was unity. People stood together, sang together, dreamed together. The music of the era didn't just entertain, it connected. It wove invisible threads between people who might never meet. A protest song, a love song, a song about freedom. They all lived in the same radio waves, filling kitchens and cars, echoing across cities and cornfields alike. When you turned the dial, you weren't just changing stations, you were changing moods, crossing borders of feeling and hope. And through it all, there was family, the quiet anchor beneath the noise. Parents trying to make life better than it had been before. Kids who didn't know how good they had it yet. Dinner tables filled with talk, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence, but always togetherness. The light above the table flickering slightly, casting shadows on faces that will forever live in memory as the faces of home. Maybe that's why the 1960s still feel alive when so many other decades fade. They weren't perfect, but they were awake. Every day meant something because people were present for it. All of it. The work, the waiting, the music, the motion, the stillness. The world was smaller, yes, but somehow it felt larger too, because everyone was a part of it, not apart from it. And as time moves on, that's what people keep reaching back for. Not the exact details, not the fashions or the prices or the cars, but the feeling. The feeling that life was something you could hold in your hands. That a single day could be enough. That happiness was already there, humming quietly beneath the sound of everyday living. The 60s didn't vanish. They just live differently now. In memory, in sound, in light, in that quiet, invisible rhythm that still beats under the noise of everything that came after. Sometimes, when I think about the 1960s, I imagine the world like an old photograph, a little faded at the edges, but still glowing with warmth. There's something about that era that feels almost cinematic now, as if every moment had a soundtrack, every shadow a purpose, every sunrise a meaning. It wasn't perfect, no time ever is, but it felt real. The kind of real that leaves fingerprints. You can close your eyes and still hear it, still taste it, still breathe it in. The decade might have ended long ago, but the life that filled it hasn't truly gone anywhere. It lingers in memory, in objects, in the rhythm of the people who lived through it. The smell of it always comes back first. The sharp bite of fresh cut grass mixing with the sweetness of gasoline and the distant hint of someone's laundry drying in the sun. It's the smell of a Sunday afternoon when everything important has already been done. The chores finished, the cars washed, the dinner prepped, and the world just exhales. There's a hum in the air, the kind that only appears when life slows down. Radios playing from open windows, dogs barking across yards, the faint metallic sound of a swing creaking back and forth. That was the soundtrack of peace. Not silence, peace. Even the light was different then. It wasn't the harsh, digital brightness of today. It was softer, more forgiving, tinted gold. It filtered through curtains in narrow stripes, settled on linoleum floors, reflected off chrome appliances until everything glowed a little. Photos from that time always look like they're covered in sunlight, and maybe they were, because light back then wasn't just something that revealed, it was something that lingered. The mornings were slower to rise, and the evenings took their time fading. Dusk stretched itself across the sky like a blanket, long enough for one more conversation on the porch, one more song before bed. The 1960s were full of texture, the rough fabric of couch upholstery, the cold smoothness of a glass Coke bottle, the rigid plastic of a rotary phone. Every object had weight. You could feel the world when you touched it. The click of a camera shutter, the soft pop of a record as the needle dropped, the slide of a drawer filled with neatly folded letters. There was a permanence to things, not just in how they were made, but in how they were valued. People held on to objects because they held on to moments. Every scratch on a table, every tear in a photograph, every creased book spine was proof that something, or someone, had mattered. And then, of course, there was the laughter. The laughter of a decade that somehow carried both innocence and discovery. Teenagers dancing barefoot in basements to songs that made their parents shake their heads but secretly tap their feet. Families playing cards around the table while the radio murmured in the background. Couples slow dancing in living rooms after the kids had gone to bed. The record spinning just a little off-center, but perfect all the same. The laughter wasn't loud or forced. It was easy, unguarded, the kind that came from simply being together. The 1960s were a time when connection was measured in presence. You didn't need to announce your thoughts or photograph every meal. You just shared the moment, because being there was enough. If someone missed a call, they called back. If someone wanted to talk, they came over. Friends dropped by uninvited. And that wasn't strange, it was kindness. It was community. And that word, community, meant something different then. It wasn't about where you lived. It was about who you looked out for. If someone's car broke down, you stopped to help. If a family was struggling, you brought them dinner. Everyone carried a small piece of everyone else's life. And somehow, that made the world lighter to hold. The future was still a bright word then, something that felt close enough to reach, but far enough to dream about. People believed in it. They believed in invention, in discovery, in possibility. But they also knew how to stay grounded. They looked up at the moon and then came home and tucked their kids into bed. They dreamed of tomorrow, but never forgot to live inside the day they already had. That's what the 1960s left behind, a lesson wrapped in memory. That happiness wasn't about having more. It was about noticing more. The way the morning sun looked on your front steps. The sound of rain on the roof while a record played quietly in another room. The way laughter could fill a house without ever being planned. The world back then wasn't simpler. It was just slower, and because of that, it felt closer. Closer to the heart. closer to meaning, closer to what mattered. And maybe that's why, all these years later, we still look back. Not because we want to return to that time, but because part of us never left it. Some small part of every person who lived through the 1960s still carries the sound of a screen door closing, the hum of a street light, the rhythm of a song that never really ended. It just faded into the background of a world that kept on turning. There's a certain quiet that lives in the memories of the 1960s, not the absence of sound, but a deeper kind of silence. The kind that comes from a world without constant interruption, a world that let thoughts stretch out and settle before the next thing arrived. That quiet existed everywhere, in living rooms just after dinner, in the pauses between radio songs, even in the long, steady drive home when headlights flickered across country roads and no one spoke for miles. It wasn't loneliness, it was space. Space to breathe, to think, to feel. That silence made life feel fuller somehow. It gave weight to small things. A ticking clock, a creaking chair, the rustle of a newspaper, all of it added texture to the moment. The world didn't rush to fill every gap. It allowed them to exist. People weren't afraid of stillness then. They trusted it. They trusted that not everything needed to be explained or captured or turned into something else. Sometimes you could just sit by the window and watch it rain, the water sliding down the glass in crooked lines, the sky heavy but beautiful. That was enough. Homes reflected that peace. Most were modest, not grand, not showy, but warm. Living rooms with brick fireplaces and wooden radios. Kitchens with pastel appliances and patterned curtains that swayed in the breeze. Bedrooms were the scent of clean laundry mixed with the faint sweetness of talcum powder. Houses back then weren't curated, they were lived in. Furniture creaked, paint chipped, but everything felt alive, softened by use. You could tell a family story just by walking through their house. The books on the shelves, the photos on the mantle, the record sleeves stacked beside the player. Every corner held a piece of someone's life. Even the way people spoke had rhythm. Conversations weren't rushed. Words weren't clipped or layered on top of one another. People listened. You could talk to a stranger in line at the post office and somehow, in 5 minutes, feel like you'd known them forever. There was no small talk, just human talk. About the weather, about the kids, about the garden, about life. There was a warmth in voices then, unhurried, sincere, steady. When someone said, "Take care," you could tell they meant it. Outdoors, the world felt bigger, not because there was more to see, but because people saw more of it. You could walk for hours without checking a clock. Children wandered freely, to creeks, to fields, to empty lots that turned into entire kingdoms. Imagination was the currency of childhood, and everyone had plenty. A cardboard box became a spaceship, a tree became a fortress, a bike became freedom. The world outside was an invitation, not a warning. Parents trusted the day to carry their children safely home by sundown. And when those kids finally came back, their shoes muddy and knees scraped, they had stories worth telling, not posts worth sharing. Nighttime held its own kind of magic. Before bed, Families would turn off the lights and let the quiet settle. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing by, the steady rhythm of a clock, those sounds became part of the fabric of sleep. You didn't drift off to noise, you drifted off to calm. Dreams came easier because your mind wasn't crowded. And in that stillness, life felt close. Close enough to touch, close enough to understand. The 1960s were full of big things: space travel, cultural revolutions, new ideas bursting from every corner of society. But what truly defined the decade were the small things. The way time stretched on a Sunday afternoon, the smell of a meal shared, the feeling of sitting on a porch and hearing nothing but the wind move through the trees. Those were the things that shaped people more than any headline ever could. It's strange, really, how something so ordinary could become sacred over time. But that's what nostalgia is, the rediscovery of meaning in the things we once took for granted. The 1960s remind us that beauty doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in the spaces between, in the soft pause before the next sentence, the final note of a favorite song, the sound of a car engine fading into the distance. That's what people miss most, not the fashion, not the prices, not even the youth of it all. They miss the space, the room that life once gave them to feel, to wonder, to simply be. The 60s weren't just a time. They were a breath, slow, deep, and steady, teaching everyone, even now, that you don't have to fill every second to live fully. Sometimes, all you need to do is listen. Sometimes, when people talk about the 1960s, they only mention the colors, the bright clothes, the shiny cars, the flashing lights of jukeboxes and neon signs. But what made that decade unforgettable wasn't just what it looked like. It was what it felt like. It was the heartbeat underneath it all, steady, human, unpolished. You could feel it in the way people moved through their days, how they balanced dreams of the future with the quiet routines that anchored them to the present. The world was changing, yes, but it was still small enough to fit inside a single day, a single town, a single life. A morning in 1967 didn't begin with screens or schedules. It began with sunlight slipping across kitchen floors, with the smell of coffee percolating on the counter, with a newspaper folded just so beside a half-eaten slice of toast. Radios were the first voices of the day, calm, confident, familiar. You'd hear the news, the weather, a local ad, and then maybe the birds singing turn, 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 before the station faded into a few seconds of static. The sound of that static somehow made the music feel even more real, as though it were traveling miles through open air just to find you. Even at work, things carried that same rhythm. Offices weren't sleek or sterile. They were full of the click of typewriters, the smell of carbon paper, the shuffle of folders being passed from desk to desk. You didn't send an email. You walked down the hall and spoke to someone. You didn't scroll through updates. You leaned against a water cooler and heard about your coworker's weekend. Communication required effort, and that effort gave it weight. People remembered what you said because they had to look you in the eye when you said it. Factories buzzed with production, But even there, the pace felt human. You could hear men laughing over the clatter of machinery, smell oil and metal and sweat and soap. There was pride in making something tangible, a radio, a refrigerator, a car that rolled off the line gleaming like a promise. Things weren't disposable yet. They were built with care, and the people who built them carried that same sense of care into everything else they did. Lunch breaks were simpler too. No takeout apps or delivery bikes. Just a brown paper bag, a thermos, and maybe a short walk outside. You'd sit on a bench or a curb, feel the sun on your face, and listen to the hum of the world. The air was always full of sound, traffic, laughter, a dog barking, a train in the distance. Somehow, it all blended together into something peaceful. People didn't rush through lunch. They let the day unfold. And when evening came, the light would change. That warm, honey-colored glow that the decade seemed to be painted in, it wasn't nostalgia. It was real. The sunsets looked slower then, as if the sky itself knew everyone needed a moment to breathe before the day was over. Families would gather again, lights flicking on across the neighborhood one by one like stars appearing on the ground. You'd hear dishes clinking, televisions murmuring, screen doors slamming softly. Every house carried its own quiet symphony, but together they made a single song, the sound of life continuing, steady and unbroken. Saturday nights had a different pulse. Teenagers drove downtown just to cruise. Nowhere to go, nowhere they had to be. Just music on the radio and the sound of tires on pavement. Gas was cheap, freedom cheaper. Lovers sat parked beneath street lamps, tracing words on fogged-up windows. Friends gathered in diners over milkshakes and fries, talking about everything and nothing. The world outside those glass windows could have been on fire or frozen still, but inside, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the crackle of a jukebox, it felt eternal. And then Sunday, quiet again. Families walking into churches in pressed clothes. Kids fidgeting beside their parents, trying not to scuff their shoes. Afterward, the streets filled with the smell of roast dinners, the sound of ball games on the radio, the soft creak of porch swings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred in its own way. This rhythm of work and rest, noise and stillness, laughter and reflection. That's what made the 1960s so lasting. Beneath the headlines and revolutions and inventions, there was an ordinary beauty, the kind that doesn't fade with time. It lived in the pauses between songs, in the steam rising from coffee cups, in the spaces where people met, spoke, listened, and simply were. It was the heartbeat of a world that still believed in connection, in patience, in the slow magic of the everyday. And even now, if you listen closely, in a quiet kitchen, in the hum of an old car engine, in the crackle of a radio left on too long, you can still hear it. The sound of the 60s still breathing somewhere, gentle and alive. There's a kind of light that lives only in memory. The way sunlight looked through the kitchen window in 1964, soft and golden, catching the steam from a coffee cup as it rose and swirled in the morning air. That's how the 1960s glow in the mind now. Not bright and blinding like a spotlight, but warm, steady, patient. It was a decade where everything seemed to exist in that gentle light, as if the world itself understood that people needed time to feel things deeply. It wasn't just a period of change, it was a pause between what life had been and what it was about to become. You could sense that pause everywhere, in the rhythm of the streets, in the spaces between songs on the radio, in the way evenings stretched out without hurry. People lived inside their days, not around them. When you went for a walk, you didn't take music with you. The sound came from the world itself, the crunch of gravel under your shoes, the wind moving through leaves, the distant bark of a dog. Life had its own soundtrack, and you didn't need to curate it. On the edge of town, the drive-in theaters still stood tall, glowing softly against the night. Couples huddled beneath blankets, families parked in long rows, the sound of the movie crackling through tiny speakers that hung from rolled-down windows. There was something beautiful about the imperfection of it. The muffled dialogue, the flicker of the film, the fog of breath on cold glass. No one complained. The world didn't demand perfection yet. It allowed things to exist just as they were, slightly flawed, slightly human. At home, the television was the new hearth. People gathered around it the way their grandparents once gathered around the radio. The grainy black and white images of the early 60s slowly gave way to color, and for the first time, the world looked alive inside your living room. You could see the blues of the ocean, the reds of parades, the green fields of baseball parks. Families leaned closer, not just to see better, but to share the moment together. There was something communal about watching the same thing at the same time across an entire country. It built invisible bridges, millions of hearts beating to the same flicker of light. Music flowed through everything. Records spun constantly. The Beatles, the Supremes, the Beach Boys, Bob Dylan, each one telling stories that somehow felt like everyone's own. Songs had room to breathe back then. Choruses repeated just enough to stay in your mind, but never too much to lose their meaning. You listened all the way through, from the first note to the last, because that's how you honored the music, by giving it your full attention. And in return, the music gave something back: hope, joy, courage, a reminder that you weren't alone in whatever you were feeling. The cars of that decade still felt alive, too. Heavy, powerful, built with intention. You didn't just drive them, you experienced them. The smell of the seats, the hum of the engine, the way the road vibrated beneath your hands. Families took road trips across states with nothing but maps, snacks, and songs to guide them. Kids counted license plates and watched the clouds drift by, their faces reflected in the glass. Gas stations were small worlds of their own. Attendants in pressed uniforms, the ding of the bell as you pulled in, the smell of oil and rubber. The open road wasn't just a place, it was a feeling, a promise that life could always lead somewhere new. And through all of it, the routines, the songs, the drives, the dinners, there was something steady, something that held life together. It was the way people looked out for one another, the way a neighbor shoveled your sidewalk without being asked, the way someone brought a pie when they heard bad news, the way everyone waved, whether they knew you or not. That sense of belonging wasn't built on rules or expectations. It came naturally. It was the invisible thread that ran through every block, every street, every front yard with a lawn chair and a radio playing softly on the porch. That's what the 1960s left behind more than anything. Not just the inventions or the music or the fashion, but the feeling of connection. The quiet knowledge that people needed each other and that kindness didn't need to be earned. It was a world that knew how to slow down, how to savor, how to simply exist without the constant pull of somewhere else. Maybe that's why it still glows in memory, because it reminds us that once, not so long ago, life didn't have to shout to be heard. It could whisper softly and clearly and still reach everyone who was willing to listen. As the decade faded into its final years, the 1960s carried a feeling that's hard to describe, like standing in the last light of day, knowing night is coming but not feeling afraid of it. There was a calm in that awareness, a sense that even as everything changed, something good had been built and would remain. The world had grown more complicated by 1969, more aware, more questioning, more alive. Yet in living rooms across the country, the same rituals carried on. Dinner at 6, the news at 7, a favorite record spinning afterward while the dishes were washed and put away. It was a time when life felt both enormous and intimate at once, when history itself unfolded in the background of ordinary evenings. The moon landing was the perfect symbol of that duality. The image of a man walking on another world beamed into small square televisions across America. Families sitting in pajamas, holding their breath, staring at a ghostly black and white figure moving across the surface of something they had only seen in dreams. The hum of the air conditioner, the faint crackle of the broadcast, the reflection of the screen in the window, it all felt unreal. Yet outside, the crickets still sang, the neighbor's porch light still flickered, and someone, somewhere down the street, was closing their blinds for the night. The extraordinary and the ordinary met in that moment. The future and the familiar shared the same air. That was the quiet beauty of the 1960s, the way it could hold contradictions and make them feel harmonious. The decade was full of movement, of people demanding to be heard, of ideas bursting like fireworks. But underneath that noise was still a soft heartbeat. Home, family, love, belonging. The world was changing fast, but the rhythm of everyday life refused to disappear. People still sent handwritten letters, still sat on front porches, still trusted that tomorrow would, somehow, be better. Optimism was woven into the decade like thread through fabric. It wasn't loud or naive. It was steady, deliberate, the belief that progress and peace could grow side by side. Even fashion reflected that balance. The simplicity of cardigans and loafers slowly giving way to the boldness of tie-dye and suede. Colors brightened, hemlines rose, hair grew longer. But through it all, There was an honesty to how people dressed. Clothes weren't about image yet. They were about expression, about saying, "This is who I am, and this is what I feel." You could tell a story just by looking at someone, where they worked, what they believed in, where they were headed next. Life was written in fabric, stitched in patterns, worn proudly in public. The cars still carried the pulse of freedom. Gas stations glowed at night like little beacons along the road. Glass fronts, chrome pumps, the sound of the bell as each car arrived. Teenagers in convertibles drove through warm air, scented with summer grass and gasoline. Couples watched drive-in screens through fogged-up windshields. And when the rain came, it didn't ruin the night. It only made it more memorable. The wipers kept rhythm with the music, the headlights blurred into soft halos, and the whole world seemed to slow to a heartbeat again. There was romance in that simplicity, in the way even bad weather could turn beautiful if you just stayed present long enough. Inside, homes became the safe centers of that shifting world. The kitchen table was where everything happened: breakfasts, bills, conversations about the future. The radio might hum in the background, the phone might ring once or twice, but for the most part, life happened in real time. You could see it, touch it, feel it. The smell of toast, the click of the toaster, the sound of silverware on ceramic. It was all grounding. The 60s, for all their revolutions, were still rooted in that daily rhythm. The smallest acts, pouring coffee, folding laundry, opening a window, carried meaning because they connected people to the moment they were in. And maybe that's why the decade endures, why its memory glows brighter with every passing year. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't peaceful for everyone. But it felt alive, alive in a way that's hard to find now, when the world moves too fast to notice itself. The 1960s asked people to believe in the future, in community, in the quiet possibility that life could keep getting better. That belief, that quiet faith, is what remains long after the headlines and fashions faded away. So when you think of that time, when you picture the lava lamps glowing softly in darkened rooms, or the hum of a needle settling into the groove of a record, or the laughter echoing from front porches on a summer night, what you're really remembering isn't just a decade. You're remembering a way of being, a way of living that trusted the ordinary, that celebrated connection, that allowed joy to exist alongside uncertainty. The 60s didn't just happen, they taught. They taught us to slow down, to listen, to feel. And maybe, if you close your eyes and let the sound of it come back, the music, the laughter, the distant hum of a simpler world, you can still feel that heartbeat. Steady, human, eternal. And when the last days of the 1960s finally slipped into history, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the soft turning of a page. The world had changed, yes, but so much of what mattered still lingered in the air, as if the decade refused to fade completely. There was something about the 60s that couldn't be packed away or replaced. It had given people something they didn't even realize they were learning: how to hope, how to dream, how to care about both the stars above and the ground beneath their feet. In those quiet moments, when a record spun at the end of a long day, or when a car rolled slowly down a sleeping street. You could still feel it. That rhythm, that pulse. The decade had its share of noise and chaos, but beneath it all ran something constant, something human. The sound of children laughing somewhere in the distance. The rustle of a newspaper folded at the breakfast table. The way two people could sit side by side, saying nothing, yet understand everything. The 1960s were made of those moments, fleeting, fragile, and yet somehow eternal. Even now, the images remain sharp. The glow of neon against chrome at the corner diner. A television flickering in black and white, pulling the family close together. A lava lamp pulsing in the corner of a teenager's room, reflecting on posters of faces that defined a generation. There was a kind of warmth in the imperfection of it all. The scratches on vinyl, the static on the radio, the flicker in the film reel. The world didn't demand polish yet. It celebrated presence. Life was lived, not optimized. It was messy, honest, full of small pauses that meant everything. People remember the big things, the space race, the protests, the music that changed everything. But what truly stayed are the smaller details. The smell of an old car's leather seats in summer. The laughter of friends on a porch swing. The way a letter felt in your hands before you tore it open. The 60s taught people that the real beauty of life isn't found in the headlines. It's in the heartbeat behind them. It's in the quiet moments when you realize you're alive, surrounded by a world that's imperfect but extraordinary all the same. And maybe that's why, even half a century later, that decade still hums beneath our memories. It was a bridge between worlds, the innocence of the past and the boldness of the future, the slow rhythm of tradition and the wild beat of change. It was a decade that believed in humanity, not the kind written in speeches, but the kind felt in touch, in music, in kindness. People looked up then, at the moon, at each other, at what might come next, and somehow believed they could reach it. And they did. The 60s may have ended, but they never really disappeared. They live on in the music we still hum, in the design of the cars we still admire, in the ideals we still chase when the world feels too cold. They live in the softness of a Polaroid, in the echo of a familiar melody, in the warmth that rises every time someone says, "Remember when?" Because remembering isn't about going back. It's about keeping something alive. So maybe that's the gift the decade left behind. Not nostalgia, but reminder. A reminder that life, at its best, is meant to be felt, not just watched. That it's okay to slow down, to look around, to sit in the fading light and know that this exact, unrepeatable moment matters. The 1960s were never just about change or color or sound. They were about being, about living in tune with the ordinary magic of each day. And as the years roll on, as the noise of the modern world grows louder, that soft echo from the 60s still whispers to anyone who listens closely enough. Be here, breathe, feel, remember, because the heart of that decade, the laughter, the music, the hope, never really left. It's still out there somewhere, glowing in that golden light, waiting quietly for you to step back into it, even if just for a moment.